The operative's fingers were already wrapped around the suppressed pistol when the hotel room door behind him opened, and 3 of Castro's DGI agents stepped inside without making a sound. He never got to turn around. A needle pierced his neck, and the last thing he saw was the ceiling fan spinning lazily above Havana. What happened in the next 72 hours would become Havana legend, a story whispered about for decades. What happened in the next 72 hours would become CIA legend, a story whispered about in Langley hallways and classified briefing rooms for decades. The story of the man they sent to kill Fidel Castro. The man Cuba swallowed whole. His name was William Alexander Morgan. And before you think you know this story, I promise you, you don't. Let me take you back, not too far, just far enough to understand how an American kid from Toledo, Ohio, ended up on a concrete floor in Havana with Cuban military intelligence deciding whether to put a bullet in his head or something worse. Morgan wasn't born into the spy world. He was born into a middle-class family in 1928, got kicked out of school, joined the army, went AWOL, did time in a military prison, got dishonorably discharged, and by his mid-20s had already burned through every second chance America was willing to give him. He was a drifter, a brawler, a guy who couldn't sit still in a room without finding the nearest wall to punch through, and somehow that's exactly what made him perfect. Believe me, the CIA didn't recruit choir boys. By 1957, Morgan had found his way to Cuba, not on orders, not yet. He showed up on his own, a restless American with combat training and nothing to lose, and he walked straight into the mountains of the Escambray and joined the rebel fighters trying to overthrow the Batista dictatorship. He wasn't the only American there, but he was the one who lasted. He fought, he bled. He led ambushes in jungle terrain that would break most soldiers in a week. And within months, the rebels gave him a title that no other American had ever earned in a Latin American revolution: Comandante, Commander. He led a column of 300 guerrilla fighters, and they followed him because he was the first one through the door on every raid and the last one out when things went sideways. Now here's where it gets complicated. Castro won, Batista fled, the revolution succeeded, and Morgan, the American Comandante, was standing right there in Havana when it happened. He was a hero. He had Cuban citizenship. He had the rank. He had the respect. And the CIA saw all of that and thought one thing: we can use him. Get this. The agency made contact with Morgan in early 1959, right as Castro was consolidating power. The pitch was simple. Castro was tilting toward the Soviets. Cuba was 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and Morgan was already inside the inner circle. He had access, he had trust, he had a gun. The CIA didn't spell it out in those exact words, but the implication was clear. Get close, stay close, and when the moment comes, be ready to act. Morgan took the meeting. He listened, he nodded. And then he did something that nobody at Langley expected. He went straight to Castro and told him everything. I swear this happened. Morgan walked into a meeting with Fidel Castro, sat down across from the most paranoid revolutionary leader in the Western Hemisphere, and laid out the entire CIA approach: who contacted him, what they wanted, how they wanted to use him. He gave Castro the whole playbook, and Castro, who trusted almost nobody, who slept in a different bed every night because he assumed someone was always coming for him, looked at this American and made a decision. He decided to trust him. Castro and Morgan hatched a counter-operation. They would play the CIA. Morgan would pretend to cooperate with the agency, feed them false intelligence, and lure any anti-Castro conspirators into a trap. It was a double cross so clean it could have been a textbook case study. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Morgan fed the CIA exactly what Castro wanted them to hear. He reported that Castro's grip was weakening, that there was internal dissent, that a counter-revolution was possible if the right people moved at the right time. Langley ate it up. Here's what nobody tells you about double agents. They don't fail because they get caught. They fail because they start believing they can play both sides forever. And Morgan, the kid from Toledo who couldn't follow rules his entire life, was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. In August 1959, the trap sprung. A group of anti-Castro exiles, backed by the Dominican Republic's dictator Rafael Trujillo, launched what they believed was a coordinated invasion. They thought Morgan was on their side. They thought the counter-revolution was real. They loaded weapons onto planes, they mobilized fighters, and they flew into Cuba expecting to be met by friendly forces. Morgan was waiting for them. But not the way they expected. He stood on the airstrip with Castro's soldiers behind him. The planes landed. The conspirators stepped out, some of them grinning, expecting handshakes and battle plans. Instead, they saw gun barrels. Morgan had played them perfectly. The entire conspiracy was rolled up in a single night. Captured weapons, captured men. And Castro went on television to announce the victory, with Morgan standing right beside him. Now listen to me carefully, because this is where the story turns, and it turns hard. Morgan was on top of the world. He was a hero twice over. Once for the revolution, once for the counterintelligence operation. He had a Cuban wife, Olga Rodriguez, a woman who had fought alongside him in the mountains. They had children together. He had land. He had status. He was, by every measurable standard, untouchable. But Morgan couldn't stop being Morgan. See, here's the thing about a man who spent his whole life breaking rules. He doesn't stop just because the rules change. Castro's revolution was moving left, fast, nationalization of businesses, alignment with the Soviet Union, political prisoners, show trials. And Morgan, who had fought for freedom, not communism, started pushing back, not loudly, not publicly, but he pushed. He spoke up in meetings, he questioned decisions, he made comments to people he thought he could trust about the direction Cuba was heading. And in Castro's Cuba, questioning the direction was the same as opposing the leader. Castro's intelligence services started watching Morgan. The man they had trusted enough to run a double-agent operation was now the man they couldn't afford to trust at all. For real, think about the position Morgan was in. He had burned the CIA by exposing their approach. He had no friends in Washington. And now the revolutionary government he had bled for was turning cold. He was a man standing on an island with no allies on either shore. And the water was rising. By late 1960, Morgan was making moves, quietly. He was allegedly helping anti-Castro rebels in the Escambray Mountains, the same mountains where he had once fought to bring Castro to power. The irony was brutal. He was now doing exactly what the CIA had originally wanted him to do, except now he was doing it alone, without backing, without extraction plans, without anyone to call if things went wrong. And things went very wrong. October 1960, Cuban state security moved on Morgan. They didn't send a memo, they sent soldiers. A squad showed up at his home in the middle of the night. Olga heard the trucks first. She grabbed Morgan's arm, but he was already on his feet, already moving toward the window, his jaw set in that way men's jaws set when they know exactly what's coming and have decided not to run. He could have run. The Escambray was right there, the mountains he knew better than almost anyone alive. But Olga was pregnant. The children were asleep in the next room. He couldn't disappear into the jungle with his family. He opened the front door himself. They pushed him face first into the wall. They tied his hands. They threw him into the back of a truck. Olga screamed his name from the doorway, and a soldier shoved her back inside so hard she fell. Morgan turned his head to look back at her, and that was the last time she would see him as a free man. The interrogation lasted weeks. Cuban intelligence didn't need a confession. They already had everything they needed. Witnesses, documents, testimony from people Morgan thought were allies. The case was built before they ever knocked on his door. The interrogation wasn't about information. It was about breaking him, making him admit, on record, that he was a traitor to the revolution, that he had been working with counter-revolutionary forces, that he was an enemy of the Cuban people. Now most people, after weeks of interrogation, after the beatings and the sleep deprivation and the isolation, they break. They say whatever needs to be said. They sign whatever needs to be signed. That's not weakness. That's biology. The human mind has limits. Morgan wouldn't break. Trust me on this. Every account, every declassified document, every testimony from people who were in those rooms or adjacent to them says the same thing. Morgan refused to confess. He refused to denounce himself. He took the beatings. He took the starvation. He sat in that concrete room with his wrists raw and his ribs cracked, and he would not give them what they wanted. And that made Castro furious. Because here's the thing about Fidel Castro, and I'll only say this once because it's the key to understanding everything that happened. Castro believed that the revolution was bigger than any individual, that loyalty to Cuba meant loyalty to him, and that anyone who turned against the revolution had forfeited their right to exist. He had said this publicly, he had said it privately, and he meant it down to his bones. So when Morgan, the American he had personally trusted, the man he had stood beside on national television, refused to even acknowledge his betrayal, It wasn't just a political problem, it was personal. Castro wanted Morgan to stand trial, a public trial. The kind of trial where the verdict is decided before the first witness speaks. March 1961, Morgan was brought before a military tribunal in Havana. He was thin, his clothes hung off his frame, but he walked into that courtroom on his own 2 feet, and he stood upright, and when the charges were read, he looked directly at the judges without flinching. The trial was short. The evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. Morgan's lawyers, assigned by the state, mounted what could generously be called a defense. And through all of it, Morgan stood there with his hands at his sides and his chin up, and he said almost nothing. When asked if he had anything to say in his own defense, he gave a brief statement. He said he had fought for the Cuban people. He said he had risked his life for the revolution. He said he was not a traitor. And then he stopped talking. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by firing squad. You need to understand something about this moment. Morgan was an American citizen. He had been born in Ohio. He had served in the United States Army and the United States government, the same government whose intelligence agency had tried to recruit him, the same government he had betrayed by going to Castro, did almost nothing to save him. There were diplomatic notes, there were back-channel communications, but no rescue operation, no serious pressure, no ultimatum. Here's the brutal truth. Morgan had made himself useless to both sides. The CIA considered him a traitor for exposing their approach. The State Department considered him an embarrassment. And Castro considered him a dead man walking. He was in the worst position a covert operative can find himself in. Burned on all sides, no one coming to get him. Now check this out, because this is where the human story cuts through all the politics and the spy games and the Cold War chess. Olga, his wife. The woman who had fought beside him in the mountains, who had borne his children, who had watched him get dragged out of their home. She fought, not with guns, not anymore. She fought with everything else she had. She petitioned officials. She wrote letters. She begged anyone who would listen for mercy, for clemency, for a reduced sentence, for anything. She went to the families of men Morgan had saved during the revolution. She went to people who owed him their lives. And one by one, doors closed in her face. Because in Castro's Cuba, advocating for a condemned traitor made you a traitor too. Olga was eventually arrested herself. The children were taken. And the woman who had once held a rifle in the mountains of the Escambray was now sitting in a cell, separated from her husband by walls and guards, and a system that had decided both of them were enemies. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because the spy stories, the James Bond fantasy, the cool operative with the gadgets and the escape plans, none of that is real. This is real. A family torn apart, children without parents, a woman in prison for the crime of loving her husband. March 11, 1961. La Cabana Fortress, Havana. They brought Morgan out at dawn. La Cabana was the same fortress where Che Guevara had overseen executions 2 years earlier. The walls were old Spanish colonial stone, thick and scarred with bullet holes from previous firing squads. Morgan was walked across the courtyard by 2 guards. His hands were tied in front of him this time. He was wearing a white shirt, dirty but not torn. His face was gaunt. His eyes were clear. A firing squad of 8 soldiers stood in a line, rifles at their sides. An officer read the sentence aloud. Morgan listened without moving. When the officer finished, he asked Morgan if he wanted a blindfold. Morgan shook his head. No blindfold. He would look at them. Now here's the detail that separates this from every other execution story you've ever heard, and I need you to hear this because this is the moment that turned William Morgan from a footnote into a legend. The officer gave the order. The squad raised their rifles, and Morgan, standing against that wall with his hands bound and his eyes open, called out 2 words. Apunten bien. Aim well. Not a plea, not a curse, not a prayer, an instruction. He told his executioners to do their job properly. He stood there, looked down the barrels of 8 rifles, and his last act on earth was to deny them the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. The volley hit him, but it didn't kill him, not immediately. The shot struck his legs and torso. He fell to his knees. Blood soaked through the white shirt, and he was still conscious, still breathing, still looking at them. The officer walked forward, drew his sidearm, and fired a single round. William Alexander Morgan was dead at 32 years old. No, for real. Let that land. A man from Toledo, Ohio, who couldn't hold down a job or follow a single rule his entire life, traveled to a Caribbean island, became a revolutionary commander, double-crossed the CIA, helped Castro consolidate power, turned against Castro when the revolution betrayed its own promises, and died against a wall with his eyes open and two Spanish words on his lips. And Cuba never gave him back. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The United States requested the remains multiple times over the following decades. Cuba refused. Every single time. William Morgan's bones are still in Cuban soil. The country he fought for, the country that killed him, kept him. Whether as a trophy or a warning or just bureaucratic indifference, nobody knows for sure. But the result is the same. The American who became a Cuban comandante left America, and America never got him back. Not alive, not dead, not ever. Now let me tell you what happened after, because the ripple effects of Morgan's story shaped things most people never connect. 3 weeks after Morgan was executed, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. April 1961. The CIA-backed operation that was supposed to overthrow Castro, it failed catastrophically, and military historians have pointed out that Morgan's original counterintelligence operation in 1959, the one where he lured the Trujillo-backed exiles into a trap, gave Castro's intelligence services the exact template they needed to anticipate and defeat the Bay of Pigs landing. Morgan's betrayal of the CIA didn't just burn one operation, it arguably burned the biggest covert operation in Cold War history. And honestly, there's a sick symmetry to it. Morgan betrayed the CIA to Castro. Then he betrayed Castro to the rebels, and both betrayals destroyed him. He died because he couldn't pick a side and stay there. Or maybe he died because he kept picking the side he believed was right, and the right side kept moving. Olga survived. That's the one piece of this that doesn't end in darkness. She spent years in Cuban prisons. She was interrogated, isolated, moved from facility to facility. But she survived. In the late 1960s, she was finally released, and eventually, after years of bureaucratic battles, she made it out of Cuba with her children. She settled in the United States. She spent the rest of her life trying to get her husband's remains returned. She never succeeded. She died in Toledo, Ohio, in 2019, still waiting, something worth knowing. In the early 2000s, when some of the CIA files on Morgan were partially declassified, a retired agency officer who had been tangentially involved in the original approach gave an interview, off the record. He said something that stuck with the journalist who heard it. He said the agency had always known Morgan was unpredictable, that his psychological profile flagged him as someone who would follow his own moral compass regardless of who was giving orders. And when the journalist asked why the CIA approached him anyway, the retired officer paused and said, "Because those are the only kind of people who can do what we needed done, and those are the only kind of people who will eventually turn on you." That's the paradox of William Morgan. The traits that made him valuable are the same traits that made him dangerous. And both sides learned that lesson the hard way. Let me give you one more detail, because this is the one that stays with me. It's going to stay with you too. When Morgan was in that courtroom during the trial, before the verdict, there was a moment. Castro himself was not present, but one of his senior commanders was. A man who had known Morgan in the mountains, a man who had shared meals with him and fought alongside him and survived ambushes because Morgan made the right call at the right moment. This commander was there in an official capacity. He was part of the apparatus that was going to condemn Morgan to death. And during a recess, this commander walked past Morgan. They were close enough to speak, and the commander stopped, just for a second. He looked at Morgan, and Morgan looked at him. And the commander's face did something. His mouth tightened, his eyes dropped to the floor, and he said quietly, so only Morgan could hear, "I'm sorry, Comandante." Then he kept walking. That's the moment. That's the one that tells you everything about what happened on that island, because the revolution devoured the people who built it. The men who fought together in the mountains ended up on opposite sides of a courtroom, one in chains and one in a uniform, and both of them knew it could have gone the other way just as easily. The only difference between the man in chains and the man in the uniform was which set of orders they decided to follow when the revolution stopped being about freedom and started being about power. If this story hit you the way it hit me, subscribe, hit that bell, because the stories I tell on this channel are the ones that don't make it into textbooks, the ones that get classified, buried, forgotten, and I dig them up. So what's the legacy of William Alexander Morgan? He's been called a hero, a traitor, a patriot, a mercenary, a freedom fighter, a double agent, a fool, and every single one of those labels is technically accurate depending on which chapter of his life you're reading. But here's what I think, and you can disagree with me, that's fine. I think Morgan was a man who believed in something. He believed in the idea that people should be free. Not an ideology, not a party line, not a flag, just the raw, simple belief that people shouldn't live under the boot of a dictator, and he acted on that belief, over and over, even when it put him in direct conflict with every powerful institution around him. He fought Batista because Batista was a tyrant. He helped Castro because Castro promised freedom. And he turned on Castro when Castro became the next tyrant. The problem is, the world doesn't reward consistency of principle. The world rewards consistency of allegiance. Pick a team, stay on that team. And Morgan could never do that. Not in school, not in the army, not in the revolution, and not in the spy game. He kept choosing the principle over the team, and eventually, every team decided he was the enemy. You know what the last entry in his CIA file says? I mean the actual last line of the last document before the file was closed. It's not dramatic, it's not poetic, it's bureaucratic. Asset deceased, no recovery of remains, file closed. That's it. That's how the most powerful intelligence agency on the planet summed up the life of William Alexander Morgan. Asset deceased, file closed. Like closing a drawer on a piece of old furniture. Neat, final, forgotten. Except it wasn't forgotten. Because here you are, listening to this. And now you know his name. You know what he did. You know how he stood against that wall in La Cabana with his eyes open and told 8 men with rifles to aim well. You know that his wife spent 58 years trying to bring him home and never could. You know that an island 90 miles off the coast of Florida still holds the bones of a kid from Toledo who couldn't follow rules and couldn't be broken. Cuba never gave him back, but they couldn't erase him either. That's the legend. A man who was too stubborn to confess, too principled to stay loyal, and too proud to close his eyes at the end. He told them to aim well, and whether they did or didn't, it didn't matter, because the thing that made William Morgan dangerous was never his ability to fire a weapon. It was his refusal to bend. And you can put a bullet in a man like that, but you cannot make him kneel. Apunten bien. Aim well. They aimed, they fired, and the legend never came home.